What happens when two bass road warriors spend quality time talking music and life with one of their peers? Bassist, educator, author David C. Gross and bassist and head honcho of KnowYourBassPlayer.com, Tom Semioli, trade dates with the legends of rock, jazz, funk, blues, folk, country, and more. Notes from an Artist, revealing conversations with the legends who've created the soundtrack of our lives. What happens? You're about to find out. It's another episode of Notes from an Artist.
It's over.
It's over, folks. Welcome to another exciting episode of Notes from an Artist. And by it's over, I mean the world is over, not Notes from an Artist. We will continue.
The world as we knew it.
The world as we knew it is over. And even after the destruction of the good planet Earth, David and I will continue Notes from an Artist. I am Tom Semioli, your co-host. David
Hold
C.
on
Gross.
a second, Tom. We have to answer a very important question.
Hang on a second.
What are the two things that will survive after the Holocaust?
Keith Richards and cockroaches.
Actually, there's a third.
Spandex and ex-wives. Four things. All right, folks. You can tell David and I are pretty stressed out, but that doesn't preclude us from doing part 4 of our 4-part Weather Report series. Now, this 4-part series, which David and I have bloviated on, is based on the book Elegant People, the history of the band Weather Report. It is out now on Backbeat Records. Our guest is author Curt Bianchi, and Curt Bianchi started the Weather Report blog in the early 00s, or perhaps even the 90s, when the blogosphere was in its infancy. He has interviewed pretty much all the Weather Report members. This is the only book he's written. He is a retired software engineer, and Weather Report was his passion as a teenager. I think he played keyboards as well. And it's among the best jazz history books ever written, says David and myself. And Curt not only tells the history of the band, but he traces its roots, special regard to the members' relationships to Miles Davis, who was really the father of Weather Report and modern jazz in many ways. And you'll hear David and I evoke Miles Davis and Bitches Brew throughout this series. Curt is not a journalist, but he did what every journalist should do. He got the facts. He spoke to the people who were in the room and who created the work, and he lets the reader decide. And he also did a great synopsis of Weather Report. They did following breakup of the band in 1986. And just to go over Weather Report, it was founded by Austrian keyboardist, not Australian keyboardist, Austrian keyboardist, composer Joe Zawinul, saxophonist, composer Wayne Shorter. They were the two leaders of the band. And Joe Zawinul and Wayne Shorter first collaborated in 1959 when they were in Maynard Ferguson's big band. Joe Zawinul went on to play with Cannonball Adderley's group in the 60s. Of course, they had that big hit, Mercy, Mercy, Mercy. Wayne Shorter was in Art Blakey's Jazz Messengers. And then, of course, in 64, he joined Miles Davis's second great quintet. Both men were not only exemplary players, but composers. And of course, Zawinul and Shorter got back together as part of the initial fusion recordings of Miles Davis. When Miles went electric, that controversial time, they were in the studio of groups that recorded the two key Miles Davis albums, In a Silent Way and Bitches Brew. They started Weather Report in 1971 to continue the Bitches Brew aesthetic. They had many, many great percussionists in the band, most notably Alphonse Mouzon, Eric Gravatt, Dom Romano, Airto, Don Elias, Peter Erskine, and Omar Hakim, to cite a very select few. However, since David and I are bass players, and again, don't hold that against us, we divided a Weather Report into 4 eras based on their bass players. Here you go. First, part 1, we talked about Miroslav Vitous. Did I say that right, David?
Yes, you did. I am so proud of you getting a name right.
Yes, David has been beating me mercifully. The last 4 weeks, the great Czechoslovakian player, he did 3 studio albums with Weather Report and a live album, and he was ousted from the ensemble as Joe Zawinul wanted to go into a more groove direction, which brings us to part 2, where we talked about Alphonso Johnson, who came to recognition with Chuck Mangione, among other players. He was recruited by Shorter. Johnson was a great player. He was a funky cat, and he's also an early advocate of the Chapman stick. And he was also a fretless player. So people think that Jaco Pastorius was the first fretless player in Weather Report. They are wrong, David. It was Alphonso Johnson. Of course, part 4 was the Jaco years, the most commercially successful incarnation of Weather Report. Jaco Pastorius, revolutionary bass player. You've heard a lot of talk about Jaco on this program. He changed the perception of the instrument, and he's cited along with James Jamerson as the greatest of all time, not including myself and David, of course. The big hit was Birdland, which became a standard. And Jaco, of course, he was also a great composer, gifted composer. He contributed such pieces as Teen Town and 3 Views of a Secret. And of course, Jaco's showmanship and stage presence made Weather Report rock stars. Then Jaco left, David, which brings us to part 4, where it really becomes a new band. And on the recommendation of Michael Urbaniak, did I say that right, David?
Brainiac, yes.
Brainiac, thank you. Joe Zawinul and Wayne Shorter recruited drummer Omar Hakim, who was a talented session player, multi-instrumentalist. He had played with Mike Manieri, David Bowie, Carly Simon, and he was the guy who recruited Victor Bailey, who's going to be the star of part 4. Schroeder and Zonal actually wanted Marcus Miller, but he wasn't available. So they got Victor Bailey from Berklee College of Music. And again, he was with Miriam Makeba, and he had worked, I think, with Patti LaBelle as well. So we have a new Weather Report in 1983. They record Procession, which is the first album post-Jaco. They did Domino Theory, and they did This Is This. Again, switching percussionists. Mino Sinulu was one of their percussionists as well. And they had vocals on records from Carl Anderson, among other people. In the last record, they had Carlos Santana, which was a contractual obligation, that last record. But let's talk a little bit about Victor Bailey.
Well, we do. I got an email from Mr. Biaggi.
Mm-hmm.
He wanted to stress that perhaps when he was talking about Joe and Jaco and their egos causing Wayne to retreat from the band, he felt he didn't say it in the proper fashion. So I'm going to read to you direct from his email. I was really trying to lead to another point, which is that while Joe and Jaco's egos were a cause of Wayne feeling squeezed out, Wayne was also dealing with a personal family issue of his own, struggling with his daughter's brain damage and his spiritual quest. Wayne began a period of retrenchment. He later said that for a long time with Weather Report, I abstained. I elected not to do things. And at the same time, I was cultivating many other aspects of my life. Okay. So I felt necessary that we add that into our show, since I couldn't really add it into part 3 because it came a little bit late.
All right. Thank you, Curt, for that addenda. So getting back to Victor Bailey. Victor Bailey was from Philadelphia. He came from a musical family. His father was a musician and a composer. His uncle, Duck Bailey, was a jazz drummer who played on numerous Blue Note records with Jimmy Smith, Hampton Hawes, Carmen McRae, Dizzy Gillespie. Victor Bailey, like Jaco, started out as a drummer, but he switched to bass guitar after the bass player in his neighborhood band walked out on band practice. He obviously excelled at the instrument, and his father encouraged him, and he went to the Berklee College of Music in Boston, David. Does that sound familiar to you?
Yes, it does. I went there.
He was hired by UMass Sakala. He moved to New York, and he became an in-demand session player pretty quickly. Among his record and concert dates, Sonny Rollins, Madonna, LL Cool J, Mary J. Blige, Lenny White, Larry Coryell, Kenny Kirkland, Mike Stern, among others. And of course, his association with Omar Hakim led to him getting the bass chair in Weather Report. Now, of course, this was a big deal back then, because how do you follow Jaco Pastorius? And there's a great quote from Victor in an interview, I think it was with a bass player. And you see Victor Bailey's confidence. He says, I don't think I ever really looked at it like I was filling somebody's pair of shoes. I felt like I was making a new pair of shoes. And that's a great attitude to take. It's really the only attitude you could take to survive that kind of pressure. Of course, Omar Hakim and Victor Bailey had great reverence for the rhythm sections that came before them, but they were young, self-assured players, and really that's the way you have to look at it. Kind of reminds me of when Darryl Jones took over for Bill Wyman. He says, yeah, I respect what Bill did. I'll certainly incorporate some of that, but I am my own person. Sadly, Victor died in 2016, complications from various neurological diseases and ALS. S. Fender had a Victor Bailey signature bass. They had an acoustic bass guitar and a jazz bass. Recorded several albums as a leader. I think 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 solo records. A Low Blow was the popular of those. He recorded with Michael Brecker. He did Omar Hakim's solo record. He was in steps ahead for a while. And of course, he did 4 records with Weather Report. So the Victor Bailey years, probably the least recognized of the Weather Report years, but still interesting in itself. I mean, obviously they were gravitating more towards being a world music band, and Joe Zawinul really took reins of the band. They started using pre-recorded tapes and things and samples and having vocalists. So this was really the beginning of the Joe Zawinul Syndicate, really. And then, of course, Wayne wanted to fold tent in 85, and they had to do one more album in 86 for contractual obligation. And that was really, again, a Joe Zawinul record. It really wasn't a Weather Report record. So let's get on with part 4. The Victor Bailey years are a concluding episode. Okay, so that wraps up the interview section of part 4 of our 4-part series on Weather Report. Great series, David. I really enjoyed speaking with Curt.
Yeah, me too. And it was really nice to put together these 4 different playlists. More importantly, where do you find this stuff?
Well, David, if you're not listening to us live on www.cygnusradio.com, you can listen to us on our podcast, which is available on Amazon, Apple, Buzzsprout, Spotify, and wherever podcasts are potted. David, tell us a little bit about the songs you selected for this.
Oh, well, I'm glad
playlist.
you asked there, Mr.
Okay.
Semioli. We're going to do 4 tunes from Weather Report: Domino Theory, Procession, D-flat Waltz, I'll Never Forget You. Now, I'm wondering, is that D-flat waltz or is it C-sharp waltz?
That's me. See, that's what I would have said. I would have said C-sharp waltz, but then again, I didn't get the bass chair in Weather Report. So.
Well, why don't you be natural or just be quiet? I don't know. Moving right along, we're going to do 4 Victor Bailey solo songs. How you get 4 into 7, I don't know, but
I don't know.
I'm sure Billy Cobham would be able to figure that out. 4 to 7. We have Knee Jerk Reaction, Do You Know Continuum. As you can hear, the Do You Know Continuum is a sort of an homage, not a fromage, of a Weather Report tune.
Or Corsage.
Then have a Corsage, yes. 2 Price Hit, Daddy's Long Leg. Then we have a couple of Steps Ahead tunes, Beirut and Rendezvous. And we have Escher Sketch. That's M.C. Escher Sketch, which is from a Michael Brecker album. And that sets us up for a wonderful final playlist for the 4-part Weather Report. Elegant People, Curt Bianchi authored.
Very good, David. On with the playlist.
See you next week.
4-part series on Weather Report.
Think about the 4 tunes we're allowed to play. Obviously, I'm going to play Milky Way. Then we'll play Cucumber Slumber. You want to play Birdland, but you don't want to play Birdland. But you have to play Birdland because it was such a big hit.
I understand.
What do we do with Victor? Because I really don't know.
So Victor himself said that Domino Theory to him was a quintessential track. I think Procession would be a great choice. It's the first track that we all got to hear. It was actually not only is it the first track on the first album that you have Victor and Omar Hakim, it was the first tune they played live with that band. So that would be a good choice too. But Victor always said that he thinks that D-flat waltz is like one of Joe's greatest tunes ever.
Yeah, and again, the book made me want to go. I went back and rediscovered Domino Theory for the first time in 30, 40 years. I love the story you recall. Kuna was playing behind Chester Thompson's drums and they couldn't see him. And Joe walks in the room and says, "Oh, I didn't know you were a drummer."
Yeah.
Just those great little anecdotes in the book.
It was fun talking to Victor and talking to Omar and also the percussionist Jose Rossi, because, I think for a lot of people, Weather Report sort of came to an end after Jaco, right? There's so much mythology built up around Jaco that the era after Jaco is not even considered. And in fact, like when Sony put out these boxed sets, they put out one of Weather Report 1971 and 1975, and then 1976 to 1982. Yeah. So they completely ignored it too. And I saw that band live, and it was a couple of times, and that band was, I think I put in the book that they're second to no one. That was a killer band. And those 2 guys talking to them were very impressive people because they're very thoughtful, very articulate. Fortunately, Victor's no longer with us. And so, it was really gratifying to be able to tell the story of that era of the band.
Yes.
Yeah.
As well as the others.
Yeah. And what an incredibly, what shoes Victor Bailey had to fill. I can't think of another bass player that had to fill bigger shoes. Imagine stepping into the Beatles if Paul McCartney. I mean, I can't think of anyone.
Yeah, I think Jocko having such a presence in the sound, not only that, but his charisma on stage. I also got to see that band live, and Jocko just commanded your attention as an audience member. Victor wasn't going to do that. That wasn't Victor's style. You mentioned them teaching bebop, I think, in Miami, right?
Yes.
Victor went to Berkeley. All he wanted to play and all he did play when he was at Berkeley was bebop on the electric bass. So of course, then he graduates Berkeley and goes to New York, and who wants to hire an electric bass player to play bebop, right?
Exactly.
He found his gigs and stuff. And then he said when he got the Weather Report, and Joe made it very clear, we don't play bebop here. We played that before. And
Yes.
Wayne and I, we've gone beyond that. So don't play bebop here.
Yeah.
Well, you were saying you saw the Jocko band live. Do you remember the Louis Falco fiasco? Did anyone ever mention that to you?
Yeah, I know of this fiasco. Of course, I didn't.
I was there.
Were you really?
I was there.
Yeah. So I mean, just to set the stage, that was, I think it was either 73 or 74 at the, where was it? At the
Beacon Theater.
Was it the Beacon? So
Right across the street from Pandemonium, by the way.
What's that?
Right across the street from Pandemonium.
David's head shop. Yes.
Well, so yes, in my research, I did come across that, and I came across some reviews. One of them was in the magazine Dance, and I don't remember if it was that review or somewhere else, but they basically said it was a fiasco, and the dancers were sort of booed off the stage or something like that. So
it was really cool.
You were there.
They were horrible, but I just felt so bad for them. I had such compassion because if you had tomatoes, it would have been.
That's a shame.
It was a really bad mistake.
Yeah, so I don't know what the impetus was to do that. They not rehearse ahead of time. I don't know. It's just one of those kind of anomalies in the history of Weather Report gigs where you just kind of go, that was an interesting one-off.
Yeah, you just wonder why they decided to do that, because they were playing behind these dancers, and it was like a merry-go-round prancing around. That's really all it was. It was bloody awful. It really was. But I still, everyone was they were a horrible audience. Kind of like, if the Beatles were playing and some other band was on first.
Yeah. Right. Everybody was there. Yeah, everybody was there to see Weather Report, right?
Exactly.
Well, Weather Report experienced some of those gigs too in the early days. Like they opened for Ike and Tina Turner.
Right.
In 1971, it was at the Beacon, and there was a ticketing issue. So they sold too many tickets. So multiple people had tickets to the same seat, stuff like that. So that was the first problem. And then, Weather Report comes on, and they were there to see Ike and Tina Turner, not this weird Weather Report band, right? And so they were met with a rude response, according to one of the reviews. And I actually interviewed Maria Booker, who was Wayne's sister-in-law, and she was one of the ones doing the promotion. And she said, "Oh yeah, I went up, I marched up on stage, and I told the audience, you're being very disrespectful." But yeah, I mean that happens when you're opening act, and I experienced that. Do you guys know the band, the Yellow Jackets?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Of course, yeah.
So the very first Yellow Jackets album that came out, it was that yellow one with the yellow jacket on the cover. We were hearing that on the radio. This would be 1981 or so. And we really wanted to go see this band. And they were performing at the Roxy in LA, and they put on a comedian before the Yellow Jackets, and he pretty much got booed off the stage. That's the only time I've been to a show where that happened. I mean, this audience was so amped up to hear the Yellow Jackets.
Do you remember who the comedian was?
I don't know. I have no idea. I mean, I felt bad for him, but it was just one of those situations where we'd been hearing these tunes on the radio for the past month, right? And this audience was as amped up as for any I've probably seen. They were just
again, getting back to Victor Bailey, yes, he was the perfect choice after Jocko. There were some similarities in the sound because he did have the J bass, and that bridge, your favorite bridge pickup, David, was somewhat favored. But yes, it definitely got back more to the ensemble playing than sort of Joe and Jocko going at it. It's almost like the band came full circle. They kind of knew that this was going to be the last version of Weather Report, so they kind of went back. Even though moving forward, still harken back to their roots as an ensemble, as everybody soloing and nobody soloing.
Yeah, and at the end of the Jocko era, I mean, Wayne and Joe, that had just run its course. Jocko was having difficulties with his mental illness, and that was showing up very prominently. It started out as this really cool thing, this really fun thing. Jocko brought this, real jolt of energy and everything. But then by the end of it, after 4 years or whatever it was,
it ran its course.
It ran its course, and they were just all ready to move on.
And of course, during the Victor Bailey years, you're starting to hear more vocals on. You're starting to hear vocals on Weather Report records.
Yeah,
which is kind of interesting. But then again, you see what's happening. We're starting to see the emergence of smooth jazz. It's getting away from jazz fusion in the 1980s, Quiet Storm, whatever it was, and you could see in some respects that traces of that in Weather Reports during the last year. Fascinating to look where Joe and Wayne went after Weather Report. Zawinul Syndicate, and then Wayne.
Let's not forget Native Dancer.
Native Dancer, right, with Milton Nascimento. Yeah, absolutely.
Brilliant recording.
Brilliant, and important one personally for Wayne as well. Whenever you hear Wayne talking about that time period, that's something that he'll talk about a lot. Yeah, I mean, it is interesting post-Weather Report careers. When they first start out, they both have their own Columbia record deals, and their records really didn't sell well enough. Columbia, I don't know if it canceled the contract is right, but basically Columbia eventually let them go after 3 or 4 albums. Joe, I heard his band many times afterwards, and it was astonishing the amount of energy his band could create on stage. He never compromised what he personally wanted to do, right? And he had an opportunity. It was suggested to him that he record an album of Ellington tunes. I'm not going to do that. I want you guys to put out my record, and it was this one called My People that he'd already recorded. So he just wasn't he was gonna do what he wanted to do. That put him out of favor with the jazz community here in the United States, right? And so eventually they got to the point where here in the States, the only places you could hear him live would be at clubs on the coast, New York,
right,
here in the Bay Area, Seattle, things like that. And he did a lot of work in Europe doing the festivals. And then Wayne he experienced the same thing as far as Columbia letting him go. He was putting out interesting albums, but they were not critically well received because they were using electronic instrumentation, things like. And then it's not until he gets with his last band around 2000, and it's an all acoustic band, right? But he recognizes it as sort of a return to his roots. That band lasted longer than Weather Report, and not only did it last longer than Weather Report, it had stable personnel for as long as it lasted, right?
Yes.
You think Columbia was sort of holding them down to sell more Weather Report records?
Holding them down to sell more Weather Report records?
In other words, since the solo records on Columbia did not do that well, were not big sellers,
right,
do you think Columbia had a hand in that? Let's keep the old thing going, because legacy was starting to happen.
Right, the reissues.
And we'll do this, but concentrate on that. Do you think that had anything to do with it?
I don't know. I think especially the music that Joe was making, it just didn't fit anywhere as far as Columbia's minds. Because you did have smooth jazz that had gotten pretty popular, right, in the 80s.
Oh, right. Yeah, right. Started in the 1980s. And yeah, again, as we've heard Frank Zappa, when they started hiring young people, young hipsters, the record business got worse and worse. And you started seeing radio being more formatted, right? We grew up in the very democratic FM radio era. Guys didn't fit into a niche.
Right. On the one hand, you had smooth jazz that had become popular. And on the other hand, you had the so-called Young Lions neoclassical aspect of jazz personified by Wynton Marsalis. Joe didn't fit either one of them. If he'd have fit one of them, then he probably could have sustained more commercial success, but he didn't. So they didn't know what to do with him. I forget what record label he was on, but one of the record producers just flat out said he didn't fit anywhere for us. If you read the contemporaneous reviews of Wayne's albums in the late 80s and early and 90s, or reviews of his live bands, there's persistent comments about how we wish he would play the tenor sax because he's playing too much soprano.
The record Marcus did with him was
we wish they wished he would go back and play like he did when with Miles. I don't know how Columbia felt about it specifically, except for the fact that his albums weren't selling. And plus, you couldn't duplicate. First off, you didn't have the name Weather Report anymore. That carried a lot of weight. Joe knew that. That's why he his next band he called Weather Update.
Right. Very clever. Yeah.
Very clever. And Joe and Wayne's names were, if you were not a super knowledgeable listener, you might not even know those names, but you would know the name Weather Report,
Sure.
right?
The brand. Yeah.
Yeah, you know the brand. And so they kind of lost out in that aspect too. It's not until Wayne gets with his last band that things really took off. And by the time, I mean, he got kind of every accolade you could get, right? At the time, they would call him the greatest living composer in jazz. Now we can just say, he's one of the greatest composers in jazz. And Joe, at least in the United States, he didn't hit that mark.
No, not at all. David and I talk about this, growing up in the 70s, we'd go see Weather Report and the Ramones in the same week. We didn't care. If it was good music and exciting, we wanted to see it. Now here we are well into the 21st century. What is Weather Report's legacy? I mean, again, David and I rail against the wintonization and how that has shaped the national dialogue on what jazz is and what jazz is not. Do people still recognize Weather Report? Do young people get it? Where are they in the 21st century?
That's a good question.
It's a tough one to answer.
There are definitely some people. I can't say, I mean, I think the casual music listener, well, I wrote this book, Weather Report. So whenever somebody asks me, what's your book about? My first comment usually is, well, it's about a band that you probably never heard of. And then they say, well, what band is that? Well, it's called the Weather Report. And usually they haven't heard of them.
Right.
I'm not talking about people who are not musically knowledgeable, just your random, person. But there's a lot of people playing the music. There's a lot of people that are still inspired by that music. I think it's kind of hard to play that music because I feel like the sounds that were employed by Joe, by Jocko, etc., are so well embedded into the fabric of the tune that in some cases it's hard to think of the tune without those sounds.
Whenever they do a Weather Report tribute, and there have been some pretty high-profile ones, David, in the city. I'm like,
one guy who really killed it on the Weather Report stuff is a keyboardist named Scott Kinsey, and he's out here on the West Coast, and he's often plays with a bass player. I can't say his name correctly.
Gary Willis.
Yeah, he played with Gary Willis, and then there's another one, Adrian Farod. Do you know him?
I know who you're talking about.
Hadrian.
Oh, yes. He was with John McLaughlin for a while.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, yeah.
If you go Google Scott Kinsey or go look him up on YouTube, and they've done some stuff, and it's a killer band that he put together that plays that music. And he's, to me, of all of the people who have sort of embodied what Joe was doing and tried to take it a step forward, I always think of him, and I love to hear him play. But there are many others, and some of them are inspired specifically by Jocko, and so they'll play the heavy weather tunes like Teen Town or Havona. And other ones are inspired specifically by Joe because they're into keyboards, kind of like Scott.
Yeah, I see from contemporary baseball, like Joe Dart will do Teen Town and things, and Wolfpack has a huge following among young people.
Yeah, and even if they're not playing Weather Report's music, I'll see a lot of times where somebody will mention Weather Report as somebody they listen to or still listen to, and somebody who has influenced them musically, even if they're not playing Weather Report tunes or music specifically like Weather Report. Question to a couple of folks, and like Peter Erskine and the guitarist Steve Kahn, and they said part of it is this legacy will be that it shows how a group of 5 musicians create and what they could do as a band. And Peter feels like that's a legacy that will continue forward. And Steve Kahn, he talked about the compositions, both Wayne's and Joe's. And he says, there's stuff that Joe is doing that we still haven't figured out, and I've played some of those tunes.
It's Peter Erskine, well, he wrote the foreword. He seems to be a great source of information.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
he's a great guy. Yeah,
I would say he's probably Weather Report's spokesman now, I guess, because there's so few of them left alive.
Yeah, well,
interesting to get he and Jorge Rossi
and Alex Acuna.
Rossi.
Yeah, it was fun for me to get to interview all of these folks, and it's just a bunch of great people.
Yeah,
so it was really, really an enjoyable part of doing the book.
Do you know what the status is of Joe Zawinul? Wasn't Joe Zawinul's son doing a Weather Report documentary? I remember seeing trailers. And then we're talking
years ago
trailers. Yeah,
that is a project. I think he ran out of money. I don't know if it's on the back burner or what the status is, but the documentary about Wayne just came out on Amazon.
Yes, phenomenal documentary. And one of the wonderful things about YouTube is to go. There's a couple of European documentaries on Weather Report. There's one great one from the UK, I think from the 80s. that's out there.
And
Granada
I think
Television.
there's a new weather report live. What is it, in Germany with my favorite band?
There is.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is.
Right.
It is.
Should be out in
The
a couple
very
of
first
weeks.
band. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I believe Joe's son, who runs the Zawinul estate, I believe he had a hand in, maybe he produced it. But yes, it's a recording. And so it's an interesting concert because it's original version of Weather Report, augmented by 3 horns. I actually wrote about that a little bit in the book because that was one of the last shows that Alphonse Mouzon, the drummer, played, because he kind of got into it a little bit with the horn players, like in a bar one night, saying, hey,
You know what? I think I remember reading that. Yes.
yeah, well, that's the show. And
wow.
yeah, so it's not a typical Weather Report show from that era because you're going to have these other musicians. I look forward to being able to hear it. And it is coming out, I think, in October.
Yeah, a couple of weeks, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. The Wayne documentary, I mentioned that because they did a fundraising thing on that years and years ago. I can't even remember how many years ago. I remember contributing to it. So it took them a decade or something. It took a long time for that. I actually thought that I would never see it. Maybe the same thing will happen with this documentary that Joe's son's working on.
Yeah.
Well, the Wayne thing, it's really amazing. They did a fabulous job.
It is tough to get these things off the ground. I know just from experience, because you have to get the rights. Just getting the right to footage is a lifetime's work in many.
I think that's a big issue, the rights, and then the cost of getting the rights.
Yes, that's it. Right. They're right.
And there's the Jocko documentary that I think they experienced the same thing, but then
Robert Trio came in with the Metallica money to get it finished.
Exactly. Yeah.
And a very poignant story of Wayne Shorter and Joe Zawinul's last performance together I think there's something of that on YouTube. I think I did find some footage.
Yeah. The whole performance, you probably still can find it on YouTube unless somebody's,
has taken it down.
Yeah. It's like a 14 to 15.
Maybe when we're editing the podcast of this, we'll put some of those links in there for folks.
Kurt, what's been the reaction from the book?
What's been the reaction?
Like David and I, this is the holy grail. We finally, and I said to David, I said, the PDF, we have to, we're going to keep going back to this book over and over and over again.
Appreciate you buying it. Thank you for that.
Well, we thought we'd give you the 39 cents directly, but
I'm sure fans must have come out of the woodwork and said thank you, and wow, I never knew this and I never knew that. And
well, yeah, I've gotten a lot of nice emails and so on and so forth. So that's been gratifying, and it's interesting writing a book. I mean, we could do a podcast about writing a book, I guess.
Yes.
Part of it for me with this book was, what kind of book do I want to write? And I thought to myself, at first, I was going to do something similar to my website where I would just do a heading for each song and just whatever I knew about it. But thought, no, I can't really. How do I start there? I have to start with who Wayne and Joe were, right? I have to start at the beginning. And so then it took on this narrative form. I wrote the book for people like me, really, who were fans of the band all through their life and just want to know how this music was made. And that's kind of what I wanted to know. So when I approached the musicians and did interviews with everybody, that's what I had in my mind of what I wanted to know. Just how did this band work? How did these tunes come into being? It got to be a pretty long book. I actually had one editor. He told me, what you really should do is you should write a book in the 33 1/3 series. Do you guys know that series?
Oh, yes. Yeah, they're little pocket books. Yeah.
That you should write a book on heavy weather, and that's the book that you should write. And I'd but that's not the book I want to write. So I just figured I'm just going to write the book I want to write.
Good move. Yeah.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, and again, one of the things, in addition to all the anecdotes, it's just amazing technologically how they pulled this off. David and I are old enough to know when you had big Trainer bass amps and SVTs and things like that. Now, David and I, we did a gig at the, Cine Winery, and I carried a 200-watt bass amp in the palm of my hand, right, David? And you had your little Hartke bass amp, which was like a toaster.
Yeah, and
we blew the place out.
You mentioned.
What's so funny though, Kurt? Whenever I'm with my amplifier, I look back at it and I think I'm watching the Spinal Tap Stonehenge because everything's so damn small.
Well, you're a keyboard guy from the 70s.
Say, one of you guys mentioned it earlier, but just looking back at some of these pictures and all of this gear, and not only was it this enormous amount of gear that couldn't withstand the road and break down all this stuff, but how primitive it actually was compared, right? Our synthesizers had no memory.
Yeah, you tell stories about
And
that.
now, and now, you can just go down to the Guitar Center and buy a keyboard for probably a few $100 that has hundreds.
Your iPhone, you can get a keyboard app, and
GarageBand.
I use my iPad and a 32 key high, and I got more sounds. Than anybody.
Right.
Yeah.
And I've carried many a Fender Rhodes up a staircase. So.
Oh yeah.
What about the
Fender Rhodes? That's a beast right there.
Right? That is a beast. All right. Fascinating stuff. Well, Curt, thank you so much for this book. Thanks for being a guest. I think the rest of our shows will be on Weather Report, Devin.
That's right. We'll be either talking about a weather report or talking about the weather reporter.
Yes.
But I got to tell you, it's a wonderful book. There's so much there. And hopefully our playlist will do it justice.
Yes. And hopefully we'll get to Peter and talk to you again, Curt, and talk to some of the surviving members of Weather Report, because it's just, and again, like I said, this, just to hear Peter read his intro and then see what he's done online, and Alex Acuna talking about this. Yeah, there's more stories to be told.
Yeah. And hopefully you can get to Alfonso and
yes, we'll get to him. Yeah, absolutely.
Be an interesting person. He's a very nice guy.
Yeah.
Unassuming. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. If they didn't know about Weather Report before,
damn it,
they're going to know more than they'll ever want to know again.
Yes, you'll win friends and influence your neighbor.
All right. Well, I thoroughly enjoyed it. It was really fun to hear your perspectives too. So.
All right. Great. All right, Curt, we'll be seeing you.
Thanks you, guys.
Bye-bye.
Take care.